chapter 4, section 3 picks up where we left off in terms of thinking about our overall strategic decision making, and section 3 is going to walk us through, or going to start walking us through, this strategic planning process. So what we're going to try and do is think about how an organization goes about actually making these decisions that are going to affect the long term of the business. So what products we're going to sell, what markets we're going to operate in, what our IT infrastructure is going to be like, and so on. So really, really important that we get this right, because if we get it wrong, a couple of years down the line, we'll realize that actually we've made a mistake, and then we have to start this process over again, most likely from a worse position to start with. So now, the order in which you carry out this planning really depends on whether you take what we call a positioning-based approach or a resource-based approach. The positioning-based approach is based on where we fit in our market, or where we fit in the environment. So for example, if you consider Waitrose and Tesco, they're going to have very different views of where they fit in that overall supermarket environment. A resource-based view looks inward, so it says actually, what do we have, what are we good at? Now, obviously there's going to be a bit of crossover there, but one is very much looking at the external environment, and one of them is very much looking a bit more inwards. Now, the overall approach here, over on the next page, takes us through each of those steps. So depending on where you start, if you start more with a positioning based with an external analysis, or perhaps you start with an internal analysis if you're more resource based, either way it's important to consider both of those things. So your external analysis will look at everybody around you. Okay, so what is happening around you? So what are your competitors doing, for example? What are the markets doing? And an internal analysis will say, well, let's look at us. What are we good at? What are we bad at? And so on. So thinking about perhaps our strengths and weaknesses. That field feeds nicely into this idea of an overall corporate appraisal. So we're going to have a look through these different stages in a bit more detail from section 4 onwards, but for now it's nice to see this overview. So a corporate appraisal, again, will show us what we're good at. Then we come up with our missions and our goals and objectives. So actually, what is our overall approach? What are we trying to achieve overall? Okay. Then I can think about what my possible strategies are. Okay, and this is where we actually make some sort of decision. I decide what I'm going to try and do from a list of possible strategies that we can adopt based upon our overall resources, our overall mission and objectives, and then I figure out where I need to go with it. So I decide what I want to do. I think about the difference between what I currently have and the kind of final goal. And that then helps me to identify exactly how I'm going to go about implementing this strategy. So this strategic choice builds in kind of how far away we are from where we want to be. When we get to the end of that process, then we can split our possible strategies into 3. So we should have some competitive strategies, so how I'm going to compete with other people in the market. I'm going to have some product or market-based strategies, so where I'm going to be selling what product. And then I'm going to have some institutional strategies. So, for example, am I going to try and grow organically, or am I actually going to try and form some sort of alliance with another business? Okay. Section 4 onwards then is going to start looking at these steps in a bit more detail. So we're going to work through a few of the tools that we can use to actually make sure that we're going to make the right decision at the end of the process. So section 4 starts to look at this external environment, and the first thing we're going to look at is a pestle analysis. Now there are various variations of the pestle analysis, pest analysis, a Pestelli analysis, all of which are just trying to do the same thing, and that's to try and use some sort of framework to consider the external environment. So it's okay to be inward looking as long as you're externally focused as well. So I can't just focus on me all the time. I need to consider these external factors. And all we use Pestle for is just to give ourselves a bit of a framework, so something to prompt us to consider the various aspects. Now again, because this is an objective style exam, short form exam, they're going to have to make the questions reasonably straightforward. So either they'll ask you for some of the components or the parts of the Pestle analysis, or they'll describe some sort of factor and have you tell them which factor it is likely to link to. Now, in real life, this is obviously a bit more subjective. So things like, for example, new maximum working hours regulation, you could perhaps put those into a couple of categories. So in the exam, to make it fair, they should really make it pretty clear cut for you. So all we're going to do is just run through these and have a chat about the types of factors that we might be needing to consider. So for example, we might need to consider, when we're coming up with our strategic options, political factors. So what impact does a new government have? Oops. So if there's an election coming up, we might need to consider what happens if so-and-so gets into power. So what happens, for example, right now, if the Labour Party were to come into power, we'd need to consider the differing policies that would then be in place and how that might affect our business. Economic factors. So, are we in a recession? What stage of the economic cycle are we in? And then I can think about what's likely to happen down the road. What does that mean in terms of borrowing rates or interest rates generally? Maybe I need to think about some social factors. So what are the current trends? And if you think about, for example, the fashion industry, there's some countless examples of things that were extremely popular for a while and then seem to drop off in terms of popularity for the next thing to come along. Technological factors are very, very important. So if you think about what your strategic options are, you need to consider what's likely to happen with technology in the future. So for example, if you were to go back, I don't know, say 10 to 15 years and put yourselves in the position of say Blockbuster Video, any kind of long-term planning that Blockbuster Video would have been doing should really have incorporated this idea that technology is changing so quickly. So the likelihood of somebody wanting to go to a store to rent a video or even a DVD or Blu-ray disc is unlikely when it's potentially going to be possible to stream these television shows and movies straight to their television in their lounge. So you really should consider any new technology that's coming along. Ecological factors. So environmental issues are much more important now in terms of how a business sees things. So obviously environmental issues are always important, but more and more businesses now are focusing on these environmental issues because they know they're going to have some efficiencies from reducing wastage and that sort of thing, but also that their customers are finding it more and more important where certain resources are sourced from. Finally, then we've got legal factors. So as I said, any sort of new regulation. So for example, if I'm a haulage company at the moment and I'm considering my long-term strategy, well, I know that diesel fuel has been the focus point or focal point of lots of discussion lately around how bad it is for the environment and potential levies and duties that people who drive diesel cars may have to pay going into the future. Section 4.2 continues to look at this environmental analysis, but this time Michael Porter looks at the kind of competitive nature of an industry, just try and consider then what that might mean for us as a business. And let me just make this a bit smaller so I can fit it onto one page there. So Porter's 5 forces was trying to look at exactly what was currently going on within my market and consider what impact this is going to have on my strategic options going forward. So the 5 forces are the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of suppliers, the threat of substitutes, the bargaining power of buyers, and then the rivalry among existing competitors. So we'll just pick through these one by one and have a chat about what they might mean for us as a business in terms of what our strategy is going forward. So the threat of new entrants is obviously very important. As soon as an industry starts to yield high returns, that's going to start bringing in new firms. And the problem is, as soon as you bring in new firms, that's going to then lead to less profits for everybody else. So if we start to see that we're obtaining high returns, for example, we're most likely going to see that we're going to have new entrants coming in. Now, the extent to which an industry is open to new entrants really depends on things like barriers to entry. So how easy is it for somebody to come in? How is there any patents protecting what I'm doing? Is there a high cost of entering the market and that sort of thing? Bargaining power of suppliers really thinks about how much power your suppliers have, or how much pressure your suppliers can put you under. So for example, if there's only one supplier and there's lots of firms that would potentially like to use that supplier, they clearly have lots of power over you then. And we need to be very careful strategy-wise that we consider that we make sure that we're considering that we may have to switch suppliers and so on. Bargaining power of customers or buyers then, again, it's going to think about the concentration of buyers to firms. So if there are lots of buyers and only one firm, well, potentially then they won't have much power over me. But if I'm one of many people selling what I'm selling, and there aren't that many customers out there, I really need to make sure that my new strategy is considering that my customers are very important. Threat of substitutes is an interesting one. Now, strictly speaking, Michael Porter said that when we're talking about threat of substitutes, buy a substitute product, really, we were talking about somebody or a product that used a different technology to try and solve the same need. So, for example, trains and airlines. Okay, so using different technology to try and satisfy the same need. And again, really it depends on what we're trying to sell, the nature of the product that we're selling. If it's something that customers tend to have a high propensity to substitute, so they're quite happy to substitute for another product, for example trains or airlines. If I was flying to, I don't know, if I had to travel to Manchester from London, for example, I'd have the option to fly, I'd have the option to jump on the train, and really I guess it would come down a lot to cost and a kind of travel time, I suppose. The final force then, the rivalry amongst existing competitors, is really just looking at how intense rivalry is right now for me. And if rivalry is very intense, that's going to have an impact on what I decide to do next in terms of my risk taking. If I don't have much rivalry, it means I can take a bit more of a risk, and actually I can perhaps do a strategy or try to adopt a strategy that is a bit riskier than I normally would, for example. The final aspect of the environmental analysis that we're going to look at is looking at the different types of competitors that we might have. So Philip Kotler listed 4 different types of competitor depending on which level the competitor operates. So not all of these we'd consider to be perfect substitutes, for example, but they're competing with us in some sort of way. So for example, first type of competitor we've got here is a brand competitor. So these are competitors that are going to be offering pretty similar products. So for example, McDonald's and Burger King. So if I wanted to go out and I wanted to get some sort of fast food and I wanted burger and chips, for example, burger and fries, I guess McDonald's and Burger King would be 2 products that would be relatively similar, and I could switch between the 2 if I wanted to. So if I'm McDonald's, for example, I need to bear in mind that as well as competing with everybody else out there that offers kind of fast food, I need to consider that Burger King would be probably the closest substitute. Industry competitors then would be similar products, but they're different in something else that's quite significant. So for example, Tesco and Amazon, they will have a reasonably large crossover in terms of the product they sell, but Tesco, I go into the store, and Amazon obviously an online store, so they're similar products but pretty different in kind of key ways. Generic competitors then are trying to compete for that same disposable income. So they're not the same product, maybe not even the same type of product or range of products, but it's trying to compete for that same allocation of money. So for example, if I have some money left at the end of the month, I might decide that maybe I'll go out and I'll buy a new DVD or something like that. The other option that I might consider would be maybe buying a new book. So they're satisfying different needs, but they're competing for the same £10-15 that I have left at the end of the month, for example. Form competitors then will offer different products. So they offer different products but satisfy the same needs. So for example, matches and cigarette lighters are very different products, but they satisfy the same problem. They satisfy the same requirement. They both light a cigarette, for example, or light a candle. Now, in terms of what this means for us as a business, I really need to consider these competitors when I'm coming up with my strategy. Again, linking back to Porter's 5 forces, that competitive rivalry is really, really important. And Kotler said that for each of these competitors, I need to consider a few things. So I need to consider what they're trying to do, so what their strategy is, what assumptions they're making about the market, how they're doing right now, and how I think they're going to do in the future, and link to that then their current capability. In the next recording then, in section 5, we'll start having a look at analysing our own business. So we've looked externally, and now I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about us as an organisation.